Nirasya sarva sandeham makikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Itam Sri Radhikanatha, itam Sri Radhika prana nata pada sarojayo, yena premanubhutyasha dattatam Sri Gurum bhaje. Shri Govindam Pararavindam Arupananya Vilashojitan Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shashvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payurasho Mudake Lato Bande Bhagavatani Mananulavam Murdna Nipatyakshito Namah Shri Krishna Chandraya Nirupadi Kripakrite Yashri Chaitanya Rupa Bhut Tanvan Prema Rasam Kalo Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamate Gati Matsarvasva Param Bhujo Radha Madana Mohano Adanastrinam dantair yacheham puna puna Srimad Rupa Param Bhoja Rajoham Sambhave Bhave Abhirapali Patiputra Kanta Dasya Vilashati Balashvavara Sri Rupa Chinta Malasapti Sangsto Matsvanta Durdhanta Haichurastam Raganugami Bhajanola Samanasanam Shri Radhaya Sahasara Smaratam Brajendhum Shri Rupa Pada Kamala Shrita Cheta Samme Chittam Satam Madhukari Yatu Pada Padme Bhaktir Yanakilarta Varga Janani Ya Brahmasik Sakshat Krite Anandatishaya Prada Vishaya Jat Sukyat Vimuktir Yaya Shri Radha Ramanam Param Bhujayugam Yasya Mahanashrayo Ya Karya Vrajalokavat Gurutara Prem Naiva Tasyai Namah Ya Ramya Nikilaga Sanga Shamani Shotra Tritim Sangata Ya Swadya Rasikai Sukabdi Janani Dhikarya Mukti Spriham Ya Dhyata Brajendra Tanaya Ya Dhyata Hridaye Brajendra Tanuja Premamrita Syandini Sajiyat Hari Bhakta Vrinda Mohita Dhanyeha Padyavali. By the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar, Prema Purushottam, Karuna Mahasagar, Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnava Charjas, Sri Rupa Gosvami Pad. Again today we will absorb ourselves in Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita. Excuse me, not the Chaitanya Charitamrita today, the Padyavali, pardon me. And we continue in the section entitled Tesham Dainyokti. We're in the Prakaran on Dainya, or expressions of Dainya. So in the last class, we began the first of this section, a verse by Sri Rupa Gosvami Pad, wherein, as we left off, he expressed that he felt that his aspiration even to perceive Krishna, even to chant Krishna's name, even to hear Krishna's flute song, did not shine, or would not be successful and was not truly endearing when kama had not receded from his heart, or when there was still the presence of what is contrary to that desire within his heart. And we left off at the end of the discussion with the point made by Baladevidya regarding his interpretation that this idea of anibrita can mean that one's heart feels discontented or a state of unrest as long as kama is present within it, that one can, in that state, feel keenly that Krishna alone is the source or the hope for one's deliverance, that his grace, his shelter is one's only prospect. So Jiva Gosvami he explains that when Bhaktas face difficulties in the course of their sadhana, that the difficulties they face themselves can also become advantages, or can also be perceived in an advantageous way by reminding one that Saeva Mama Sharanam, that he, Sri Krishna alone, is my only shelter. And that in that way one can draw benefit even from the impediments one faces, because they can be converted, if you will, into something that inspires humility and prayer, or entreaty to Bhagavan that is based on humility, what is called a dainya bodhika vigyapti in Sri Rupa Goswami's language. So, having concluded on that point about Gajendra, then we come to the next verse here in the Padyavali, where Rupa Goswami refers to Gajendra by comparing his mind to Gajendra and his plight in samsāra to the plight Gajendra faced. So today we'll look at this verse, which is also found in the Stavamala, and the import that can be drawn from it. So I start from verse 60. Saṁsārāmbhasi sambhṛta-bhrama-bhare gambhīra-tāpa-traya grāheṇābhigṛhītam ugra-gatinā krośantam antar-bhayāt dīpreṇādya sudarśanena vibudha-klānti-cchidā-kāriṇā cintā-santatati-ruddham uddhara hare mac-citta-dantīśvaram. So he says, within the water of samsāra, filled with numerous whirlpools, seized by the fiercely charging crocodile of the three formidable miseries, crying out to you out of fear in the heart, and burdened by an incessant stream of worries, O Hare, with your shining sudarśana, which cuts away the weariness of the vibhudas, please now deliver the Gajendra of my mind. I'll read it one more time. Within the water of samsāra, filled with numerous whirlpools, seized by the fiercely charging crocodile of the three formidable miseries, crying out to you out of fear in the heart, and burdened by an incessant stream of worries, O Hare, with your shining sudarśana, which cuts away the weariness of the vibhudas, please now deliver the Gajendra of my mind. So, now we'll dive into how our commentator on the Padyavali, as well as Baladevidya have discussed this verse and other relevant points from the works of Sri Rupa, Sanatana, Chakravartipad, and others. In this verse, the compiler compares his own mind to Gajendra, who's referred to here as, quote, the king of elephants, or Dantīśvaram. So one word for an elephant is a danti, as elephants are known to have big tusks, then danti, or tusked, or one who has a tusk, is a name for an elephant. So Dantīśvara would be the king of the elephants, so Gajendra. So the compiler compares his own mind to Gajendra and prays to Bhagavan to deliver him, just as Bhagavan delivered Gajendra, to convey that he feels himself to be in a state of urgent distress, or arti, that is, acute humility, similar to that of Gajendra when he was attacked by a crocodile. So we're here in the Dainyokti Prakaran, or the expressions of Dainya. So every verse in this section is going to be expressive of this feeling of distress, or this feeling of heartache or lowliness within oneself. So Gajendra is a prime example of someone who was in distress and who called out to Bhagavan. So here Rupa Goswami compares his own mind in its plight in samsāra to the Gajendra who was in distress and sought Bhagavan's protection. So as Gajendra in distress cried out to Bhagavan for protection, so the compiler describes the Gajendra of his mind here as, quote, crying out to Sri Bhagavan, out of fear in the heart, antar-bhayāt. So now we're going to dive into a discussion of this fear. What kind of fear is being referred to here, and how? The fear spoken of here by the compiler, however, should not be confused with any conventional form of fear felt by embodied beings in samsāra, that arises from the desire to avoid physical pain, the death of the body, and so on, based on identification with the body, ignorance of the essential nature of the true self, and other aspects of Maya's influence. So as per the well-known verse, bhayam dvitiya bhini veshata syat, that fear arises from absorption in, or identification with, a second. The second being the non-self, or the body. So when we're identified with the body, then we experience fear based on the threats that are posed to the body in the material environment. So when Rupa Goswami is saying, I have fear in my heart here, is that the kind of fear he's talking about it? Is it just the fear that every embodied being faces? Or is it something else? Although the distress felt by Gajendra, because of the threat of defeat and death he faced from the crocodile attacking him, did initially motivate him to perform an act of bhakti in the form of praying to Bhagavan for protection. The compiler explains in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu that it was only after that, when, by the grace of Bhagavan, Gajendra became free from this distress, that initially motivated him to pray to Bhagavan, that he actually acquired eligibility, or adhikar, for pure, that is, uttama bhakti. Since it is only someone who is free from both desire for enjoyment of worldly objects and desire for liberation from worldly suffering that is a bearer of eligibility for pure bhakti. So this is discussed in the adhikars prakaran in the Sindhu, which is something we discussed recently in our Chaitanya Charitamrita classes. So the four Kumaras are described as Gyanis, Shonaka and the other sages are described as inquirers, Dhruvas described as a seeker of wealth, and Gajendra is described as one who is in distress, to exemplify the four types of persons who are said to worship Krishna by Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, in this well-known verse 7:16. But Rupa Goswami says, although all of those persons performed worship or performed bhakti, they did not in that state perform pure bhakti or uttama bhakti, because their motivation was colored by the object that they sought, be it freedom from suffering or the attainment of something satisfying or what have you. So Gajendra was feeling fear for his life, for his own body, from being defeated in this fight, and he was in distress because of that. So is this prayer of Rupa Goswami merely that, saying, I'm just suffering in the world, oh God, save me from my suffering? No. So to clarify that, although it doesn't specify in the verse itself the cause of the fear, we can understand that the prayer in this verse is a prayer by someone following the path of Uttam Bhakti. Therefore, it's a prayer which isn't motivated by merely avoiding worldly suffering. So what's motivating it then? How is this fear arising not from the miseries of samsara, even though the miseries of samsara are being described here, but how is it arising from something that is integral to Uttama Bhakti? So to discover that, we'll look at a series of statements from Prahlad Maharaj in the 7th canto. That followers of the path of pure bhakti are free from such conventional forms of fear is demonstrated by a statement of Prahlad Maharaj to Sri Bhagavan in Srimad Bhagavatam 7.943. Quote, my mind absorbed in the great nectar of the songs sung by singers of your feats, I am certainly not afraid, O Supreme One, of the insurmountable Vaitarini, that is, samsara. Still, I pity the fools whose minds are averse to that great nectar, bearing the burden of worldly life for the sake of the illusory pleasure produced by objects of the senses. So the key point of focus in this verse of Prahlad here in our discussion today is he says, I am certainly not afraid of the insurmountable Vaitarini, which is a way of speaking of samsara. So Prahlad Maharaj is saying, I have no fear of samsara. So it should thus be understood that the, quote, fear in the heart, or antar-bhayāt, felt by the Gajendra of the compiler's mind in the verse under discussion, is not any form of conventional worldly fear, like that initially felt by Gajendra himself. So although Gajendra did feel fear, and although the mind is being compared to Gajendra, still the comparison isn't meant to imply that the fear felt in the heart of this mind being compared to Gajendra, or inside this mind being compared to Gajendra, depending how you want to render it, is the same as the fear Gajendra felt. Otherwise, this expression would not be within the scope of the compiler's own line of thought and teaching. So to demonstrate that, or to interpret the compiler's poem in the line of his own theology and approach to bhakti, we're doing this analysis. So what is it that this person is fearing if the hallmark or the epitome of a pure bhakta, uttam bhakta, Prahlad Maharaj says, I'm not afraid of samsara at all. So we come to that here when we look at another statement of Prahlad Maharaj, the same Prahlad Maharaj who just said, I'm certainly not afraid of samsara, where a few verses earlier, note that the verse we just quoted was 7.943, now we'll look at 7.916. So just, little more than 20 verses earlier in the same address that he makes to Bhagavan, he does describe himself as afraid, and afraid of the very same thing, samsara, Vaitarini and samsara being synonymous. So how is it that in the same address to Bhagavan, he describes himself as both afraid of samsara and not afraid of samsara? So that's what we're going to discover. So he says, quote, cast among devourers, or asuras, and bound by my own karmas, I am afraid of the havoc of the fierce, difficult-to-bear wheel of samsara. O you who are affectionate to the pitiable, O greatest beloved, When will you be pleased and call me to the shelter that is itself liberation, the soles of your feet? So, the commentators have nicely addressed this apparent contradiction, if you will, in Prahlad Maharaj's statements, where he says, I'm not afraid, or rather, first he says he's afraid, and then later he says he's not afraid. So, Sri Chakravartipad elucidates the specificity of the fear Prahlad Maharaj expresses in this verse, in contradistinction to the fearlessness Prahlad Maharaj expresses in Srimad Bhagavatam 7.9.43. Quote, I am afraid specifically of the bad association that engenders aversion to you. Thus, he says, trustos me. He speaks 7.9.16. I am afraid specifically of the havoc of the wheel of samsāra, which is fierce and difficult to bear, because of its being filled with enmity, defamation, and so forth of you. In this way, the intention of Prahlad is to be explained in accordance with his forthcoming statement in 7.9.43, which we quoted a second ago, my mind absorbed in the great nectar of songs sung by singers of your feet, I am certainly not afraid, O Supreme One, of the insurmountable Vaitarini. In this verse 743, Prahlad Maharaj says to Bhagavan, for my own sake, I certainly do not pray for deliverance from samsāra. Quote, I do not pray for deliverance from samsāra. O Supreme One, O you who are the greatest of all, I am certainly not afraid of the Vaitarini. In this regard, the reason is that my mind is absorbed in the great nectar of songs sung by the singers of your feet. Sri Chakravartipad's point in this analysis is that the fear expressed by Prahlad Maharaj in 7.9.16 is not of conventional forms of suffering in samsāra and based on delusional identification with the non-self, but rather only of the elements within samsāra that are unfavorable to bhakti, to Bhagavan, which is his sole desired object. Since, in 7.9.43, Prahlad Maharaj expresses that when his mind is absorbed in the nectar of narrations of Bhagavan, that is, absorbed in bhakti, he has no fear of samsāra at all, and thus does not pray to be delivered from it. On the contrary, however, when he feels that his mind is unable to remain absorbed in narrations of Bhagavan, then Prahlad Maharaj does express alarm, as can be observed in another verse in the same address Prahlad offers needs an S, to Sri Bhagavan. Quote, O Lord of Vaikuntha, this mind, corrupted by sin, unholy, impetuous, afflicted by kama, and beset with elation, sorrow, fear, and desire, does not take pleasure in narrations about you. Therewith, how can this wretch contemplate your existence? So in 7.9.43, he says, my mind is absorbed, I'm fearless. But a few verses earlier, just 4 verses earlier, in 39, he says, my mind is afflicted by kama and corrupted by sin, and it takes no pleasure in narrations about you. So how can I think about you? How can I meditate on you? So, in one sense, when his mind is being disturbed, or when he's unable to absorb his mind in Bhagavan, then he's lamenting, then he's in a state of want and need. But when his mind is absorbed, he's fearless. So in 16, when he says, I'm afraid of this havoc of samsāra, what he means is, I'm afraid of those things that impede my mind's absorption in you, that impede devotion to you. So his fear is based on his attachment to Bhagavan, rather than attachment to the body or attachment to the false self. So that fear is integral to his desire to serve Bhagavan, his attachment to Bhagavan, his enactment of bhakti to Bhagavan. So it's categorically distinct from fear of the death of the body or the displeasure of the mind or the various other forms of what you might call separate interests that jivas conditioned by Maya, who are not in the path of bhakti, experience. So, therefore, the whole point being made is that when the Gajendra of the mind in this poem that we're discussing says that I'm feeling fear in the heart, then that fear is the fear of obstacles to bhakti or unfavorability to bhakti, not simply fear of dying the way Gajendra was afraid of dying from the bite of a crocodile. But we can see more of this elaborated in the commentaries of Chakravarti Pad and Jiva Goswami Pad, so we'll look at that. Sri Chakravarti Pad elaborates. Prahlad Maharaj, I should add this, says to Bhagavan, descending repeatedly to this world, you shower the nectar of your own form, qualities, and leelas upon jivas here. Still, my sinful mind does not take pleasure in that. Instead, it just falls repeatedly into the ditch of foul objects of the senses, durvishai. What shall I do? In this spirit, he says naitat, or he speaks this verse. So in other words, specifically in a state of mind when he finds that his mind is getting repeatedly distracted, when his mind is repeatedly going to objects of the senses and even sinful objects of the senses, then he becomes dispirited. He feels a sense of lowliness, he feels a sense of distress, or he feels dainya, humility, and then he prays, how can I contemplate you when my mind is in such a state? So this expression of want and this expression of concern or alarm is based on the state of mind that he's in at that time. It's not necessarily categorical and referent to the whole of his existence. This is one crucial point to grasp. So when Prahlad speaks, then Bhagavan replies or asks, well, why doesn't your mind take pleasure even in these highly relishable narrations of my form, qualities, and leelas? Because narrations of Bhagavan's form, qualities, and leelas are certainly highly relishable, especially when presented by the likes of Rupa Goswami and his company. To that, Prahlad Maharaj says, his mind is, quote, corrupted by sin, meaning it is like a tongue afflicted with jaundice that does not take pleasure in sugar candies. So just as something is actually sweet, but because of the condition of the tongue one doesn't taste it to be such, then when the mind doesn't find Bhagavat Katha relishable, it's not that the Katha is not relishable. The Katha is definitely relishable. It's due to the unfavorable conditioning of the mind that it's not experienced to be. Thus, the comparison to jaundice. Therewith, that is, with such a mind, how shall I contemplate your existence? So when my mind is jaundiced, then how will it get absorbed? Because the mind only gets absorbed in things that cause pleasure. If I'm not feeling the pleasure, I'm not going to have the absorption. If I don't have the absorption, I'm not going to be able to engage. So this is a problem. This is a cause of fear. This is a cause of alarm. So, in that sense, Prahlad expresses concern. But again, that concern is based on his attachment to Bhagavan. It's based on his desire to engage in bhakti to Bhagavan, as Jiva Goswami says in the next comment. So Sri Jiva Pad also clarifies as follows the varying intentions of Prahlad Maharaj in these aforecited statements. The earlier statement in 916, quote, I am afraid of the havoc of the fierce, difficult to bear wheel of samsara, was made specifically on account of the distastefulness of the association of those who are oblivious of him. Okay, highlight that, right? So what is Jiva Goswami saying? What is Prahlad Maharaj, who's famous for being fearless, when Bhagavan threw him off a cliff, subjected him to flames, tried to have him trampled by elephants, and all sorts of other tortures, he was not afraid. But he does feel afraid of Bahirmukha Sangha, of the association or the interaction with and companionship with those persons who are averse to Bhagavan or who are oblivious to Bhagavan. In other words, that Sangha, which fosters samskaras which are contrary to the bhakti samskar, that is a problem, or that poses a threat in a general sense, in the feeling of a bhakta. Of course, the bhakti samskar lodged in the chitta by the action, or the leverage, if you will, of the chit shakti cannot be uprooted by the maya shakti, but here, from the perspective of the bhakta, that ontological aspect is not directly applicable. So, this bahirmukha sangha, or this association with persons who are averse to Bhagavan, is arochaka. It's distasteful. It's, not only does it lack taste, but it's not nice. It might be full of all kinds of nice arts and culture and pleasantries and all things of the world that are otherwise fine. But for a bhakta whose intense affinity is for Bhagavan, for Bhagavad Katha, it's felt to be distasteful. Even the refined pleasurability of it in the worldly sense can even be felt to be more distasteful than even if it were mediocre. So this is Prahlad Maharaj's sense of fear, that he finds things that are contrary to bhakti or apart from bhakti to be distasteful. So when he's confronted with perception or interaction with this vast domain full of that unfavorability or full of that averseness, then he finds that very distasteful. This leaves him saying, I am afraid of all this havoc. So the point being, his, quote, fear is based on his attachment to Bhagavan, his relish of Bhagavad Katha, his relish of Bhagavad Bhakti, and his desire to be ever absorbed in that, ever more absorbed in that. Now, the statement in 7.943, I am certainly not afraid of the insurmountable Vaitarini, is to be considered to have been made because of Prahlad Maharaj's being absorbed in the sweetness of the nectar of the narrations about him. And so when a little later his mind does become absorbed, then when he's talking, he's saying, oh, I'm not afraid of anything here in samsara. So the only thing he's afraid of is not being absorbed in bhakti. And the earlier statement in 7.939, this mind does not take great pleasure in narrations about you, is to be considered to have been made by Prahlad out of an exceedingly intense thirst to relish the nectar of narrations about him, on account of the variegated flow of various bhavas in the hearts of Bhagavan's bhaktas in the course of their ever-unfolding immersion in bhakti to Sri Bhagavan. So this statement is something we touched on at the very end of the last class, the very final statement here in the Tika. Bhavanam vichitra gati-tvat. That bhavas have a variegated flow, which is to say that so many of these prayers, whether it's in the case of Prahlad Maharaj, or it's in the case of Narottam Das Thakur Mahashai, or in the case of Rupa Goswami, or so many other great poets that we study in our Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, not all of their expressions are made in the same state of mind, considering the same factors with the same set of focus. So, as per different circumstances, as per different sentiments, as per different states of mind, then they say things that can even appear opposite to one another or to contradict each other. Just as Prahlad Maharaj here in this verse, in one verse is saying, my mind is so polluted it never gets absorbed, and then 4 verses later is saying, my mind is so absorbed I'm completely fearless. So, Prahlad Maharaj is not foolish, he's not just, merely contradicting himself, so to speak, but he's speaking profound sentiments from different states of mind, or from different states of absorption, showing both the joy of bhakti when the mind becomes absorbed, as well as the humility of a bhakta when one is encountering an obstacle, or when one is encountering a sense of an obstacle due to the intensity of one's desire, even if that obstacle is actually not really there or is, very minor. So in this way, we can adjust how so many different statements are made and why even great bhaktas may pray or may express themselves as though they're not. As we've touched on in the past, the nature of prema is intense, loving desire to serve Bhagavan. As a fruit of that desire comes, what Jiva Gosvami refers to here as ati trishna, or exceedingly intense thirst. So, in other words, when one has that thirst, one is always wanting more and more, and then such that one even feels that one hasn't had any. A harsh, if you will, analogy might be something like an addict who might consume a drug and then out of their addiction want more and more and feel as though they've hardly had any when they might have actually had a whole lot. Something like that, when these bhaktas have a very intense desire to relish or to serve, then they feel as though they have nothing. They even speak as though they're in want when they're actually in a state of abundance. So this illustrates the intensity of their desire. So in that way, when as a fruit of that desire, they at times feel great states of absorption and bliss, they speak to that bliss, and at times when they feel a great state of want and longing, they speak to that longing, and in the course of daily life, in the course of lila, in the course of circumstances, from time to time, these two different poles or these two different sides of the coin are taking place. So there's a natural unfolding or a natural flow, if you will, in the course of what is experienced. Then one more point here from Chakravarti Pad, which also adds some color and image to this discussion. Although the great Bhagavata Prahlad Maharaj's mind is not of such nature, that is, although it is not actually corrupted by sin and comparable to a tongue afflicted by jaundice, as he expressed in 7.939, as per the evidence of its not being such, found in his forthcoming statement in 7.943, my mind absorbed in the great nectar of the songs sung by singers of your feet, I am certainly not afraid of the insurmountable Vaitarini. So he's taking 7.943 when Prahlad Maharaj says, my mind is absorbed and I'm fearless. He's saying that's actually Prahlad Maharaj's mind in the proper sense. It's completely pure, it's completely absorbed, it's completely fearless. So when a few verses earlier he says that it's polluted by sin and subject to distraction and as if afflicted by jaundice, it's not actually like that, but he's experiencing it at a particular state or a particular time to be like that. So he says, still, such a statement of a person possessed of prema, like Prahlad Maharaj, made in 7.939, only out of an upwelling of intense humility on account of being immersed in the various extraordinary waves of prema, is not contradictory. So he's saying, don't think Prahlad is contradicting himself, even though he says two things that are completely opposite to each other, just 4 verses apart, because these are like different waves in the flow of his prema. And prema sometimes brings forth expressions of joy, sometimes brings forth expressions of humility. So there's no contradiction, there's rather a highly accurate depiction of different expressions that prema assumes. So, Sri Chakravarti Pad's point here is that it is not a contradiction for a bhakta like Prahlad to on the one hand say that he has such a polluted mind that he cannot absorb himself in contemplation of Bhagavan, as he does in 7.939, and on the other hand to say in 7.943 that he is not afraid of the Vaitarini, that is saṁsāra, by virtue of being absorbed in the nectar of narrations of Bhagavan, because his statement of being fearless was made while he was mentally absorbed in the nectar of narrations about Bhagavan, and his statement of being fearful was made while he was mentally absorbed in a state of, humility. And both of these states of mind arise from time to time in the mind of a bhakta endowed with prema, just as various waves continually arise in an ocean. as Sri Jiva indicated in the aforesaid commentary on 7.9.43. Thus, okay, so all that discussion complete. Now we're applying that to analyze what is the intended sense of the fear felt by the Gajendra of the mind here in the verse of Rupa Gosvami. So, the compiler's intention in the verse under discussion, in comparing his own mind to Gajendra and describing this Gajendra as having fear in the heart, should be understood to refer to fear not of worldly existence in general, based on delusional identification with a false sense of self and the desire to avoid conventional worldly suffering, but rather to refer specifically to unfavorability in regard to bhakti, in the form of exposure to persons, activities, and so on, that are unfavorable to bhakti. So, the Gajendra of the mind is in fear of the things that can inhibit or can produce contrary influences to bhakti. Now, we'll look at what the other aspects here in the metaphor represent. As Gajendra was in the water of a lake near Trikuta mountain when he was attacked by a crocodile, so the compiler compares the world of saṁsāra, in which his mind is enmeshed, to a body of water. Sri Vidyabhushan elucidates this by explaining that the, quote, water of saṁsāra here refers to a body of water of unfathomable depth that represents inclination towards the objects of the senses, vishaya vasana. The implication being that there is verily no end to the myriad of inclinations toward the variegated features of worldly existence that permeate the psyches of jivas in saṁsāra. These inclinations obstruct absorption of the mind in bhakti to Bhagavan, and thereby endlessly perpetuate the jiva's bondage in saṁsāra. Quote, Kama is the one and only bondage, that is, the one and only cause of all jiva's bondage in saṁsāra. There is no other bondage in this world. One who is free from the bondage of Kama is fit to realize Brahman. So, here, saṁsāra is compared to an ocean. So we've all experienced swimming in the ocean or swimming in a deep, big body of water, most likely. So the ocean, if you will, that the mind is stuck in is this ocean of all these vasanas, all these inclinations and impressions for experience of all these varieties of objects of the senses in saṁsāra. And there's no end to all the permutations that they can assume. In the modern day with AI and, visual imagery, now it's, very easy to understand and observe how many mixed up ideas and how many different, inclinations and ideas and fantasies and, poor tastes and so on and so forth can be expressed. So they're undoubtedly like, an ocean or a vast body of water that one is submerged in. And it's these vasanas that bind us in saṁsāra, not anything else. This statement in the Mahabharata is saying that it's only our desire for the things of saṁsāra that bind us in it. It's not anything else. If we were actually desireless, we would easily realize Brahman. We would easily realize something transcendent to saṁsāra. It's the mind's conditioning towards the phenomenal plane or towards the objects of the senses that inhibits the mind from meditating upon, from being graced by an object beyond that sensory, beyond that material or prakritic plane. So it's really only these desires or these vasanas, which are the basis of these desires, that is the bondage, that is the submerged state that we're in. So this is very valuable to understand, because if we want to get out of the water, so to speak, then we understand we need to purify the mind of all these vasanas. We need to become free from kama, which is precisely what was said at the end of the previous verse, that when kama has not receded from the mind, then even if we do have some inclination or some desire for Krishna, for all these higher spiritual things, it doesn't shine, or it doesn't come to bear fruit at that time. That this water of samsara, that is, this myriad of inclinations towards worldly objects, is said to be filled with numerous whirlpools, sambhṛta-bhrama-bhare, further indicates that the mind enmeshed in samsara is subject to severe delusion. The implication being that inclination towards worldly experience results in jivas becoming severely deluded, such that their minds either foster aversion to bhakti to Bhagavan, or they suffer from repeated distraction and unfavorable counter-absorption. As Prahlad Maharaj described in 7.9.39. So, if it's one thing to be submerged in water, it's another thing to be pulled into a whirlpool, or if someone's ever been pulled by a riptide, then they understand how difficult it is to resist and how strong those things can exert their power over someone. So, by speaking of these whirlpools, then the implication is that the delusion that's created by all these vasanas just drives the person away. Just as a person gets sucked out to sea by a riptide or sucked down the river by a whirlpool, just like that, the person's behavior, the person's thoughts just goes off on the pull of those vasanas in a deluded state, such that one finds that it's very difficult to fix the mind upon Bhagavan, to direct the mind towards bhakti, or in fact to control the mind and fix it on any specific point. So as this, river or this water of samsara is said to have many whirlpools, so the mind oscillates and flows in through various states of, delusion, or various states of being preoccupied with things that are actually lacking in substance and contrary to the interests of the soul. Sri Vidyabhushan Pad comments on a variant reading of sambhṛta-bhrama-bhare as dusta rormi ghane, impassable because of insurmountable waves, which he interprets to imply that the water of samsara is impassable because of the 6 insurmountable waves faced by everyone therein, of hunger, thirst, sorrow, delusion, aging, and death. The implication in the case of this reading, being that the mind becomes so agitated by thoughts of these 6 aspects of worldly life that it struggles to remain absorbed in bhakti to Bhagavan. So whether you refer to the delusional aspect or more broadly to both the delusional aspect and the other poles of embodiment or complexities of embodiment, if you will, such as, being hungry, being tired, being thirsty, being upset, getting old, dealing with, avoidance of death and so on, then this, busies the great majority of people in the world completely, such that they don't even take time to consider spiritual matters, or even if they do, they feel they can't allocate much time to them. So this is, what he calls insurmountable waves, or it's as if they're immersed in this, with all these vasanas, and then on top of that, all these waves are coming to drag them further into involvement with those vasanas, such that those vasanas further deepen, such that their entanglement is, perpetuated and further intensified. As Gajendra was attacked by a crocodile, so jivas in samsara are said in the verse under discussion to be, quote, seized by the crocodile of the 3 miseries. That is, those that occur by means of the self, other entities, and destiny. So I've given here definitions of the 3 miseries and examples of them from the Vishnu Puran and Samipad's Tika on the Vishnu Puran. I'm not going to read through all of that. I think everyone's well acquainted with that. Those details are available for anyone who wishes to pursue them. We've gone through those in the past in other classes. So moving on to the import of the metaphor, this crocodile of the three miseries is further described as, quote, fiercely charging, or ugra-gatinā, to underscore that these three miseries are inescapable and imposed as though mercilessly upon jivas in saṁsāra. Sri Vidyabhushan Pad comments on a variant reading of ugra-gatinā as ugra-matinā, fierce-minded, which he interprets to mean of cruel mentality, because malice, malignity, and so on. The implication again being that the three miseries are as though mercilessly imposed on jivas enmeshed in saṁsāra, such that such jivas inevitably struggle to remain absorbed in bhakti to Bhagavan in the midst of them. Okay, now one point I'm bringing here is that although here he's trying to say that these miseries are like a crocodile that's biting you, so a crocodile that's attacking you and biting you is scary and not considered something nice or considered something, pleasant or something invited, but rather something that's fierce, something that's, cruel, intending to kill you and eat you. So despite that intent, or despite that color, if you will, of the metaphor, we also discussed, as per commentaries on the verse Tatte Nukampam Susamikshamano, that a bhakta shall nevertheless see the reactions to their own karma coming to them in the form of these three miseries to be expressions of Bhagavan's grace. This was discussed earlier in regard to the quality of being tolerant like a tree in the Shikshastakam. So to balance these 2 points, we can say that the way that these miseries descend upon you can be described as merciless, or in other words, can be described as clockwork allocation of your karma. And, if you've ever been in a car accident, or you've ever been in a motorcycle accident, or any type of accident, it can, come upon you faster than you could ever realize. It can charge upon you in a way that seems cruel or wasn't fair or what have you. So this metaphor is intended to refer to the characteristic or the aspect of how these things might be experienced in their taking effect. However, a bhakta shall also see, atmakritam vipakam, that the results to the things they themselves have done. Jiva Goswami's commentary, as we discussed there, was that even these reactions to our karma are actually expressions of Bhagavan's grace. So that merciless, attack of our karma, if you will, can simultaneously also be perceived as a merciful extension of Bhagavan's grace, or rather the fact that he allocated such karma to us, or allowed such karma to be allocated to us, can also be perceived as his grace. So there can be, without any contradiction, an idea that this is both gracious and merciless, if you will, at the same time. And for me, that's not a contradiction, but rather to be able to see even these merciless attacks, if you will, as actually in a deeper sense expressions of grace. This is the beauty of the way of seeing the world that a bhakta acquires by virtue of the Bhagavatam, by virtue of the association of Mahatmas, by virtue of all these beautiful teachings that we receive, that even one thing that's typically experienced or felt to be one thing ultimately can be experienced as a relishable form of its opposite. That's wonderful. But we don't want to detract too much from the general thread or theme of the metaphor here, which is describing the plight of the jiva in this conditioned state. So, moving on, I don't know if we're going to get through this whole discussion today, but I'm going to go a little further. If I go a little over time, I hope it's okay. If anyone needs to sign off, please feel free, but I'd rather do this in one go. So, under such conditions in samsara, that is, because of the inclinations towards worldly objects embedded in the psyche, the compiler further describes the Gajendra of his mind to be, quote, burdened by an incessant stream of worries. The implication being that the mind is repeatedly distracted from bhakti to Bhagavan by thoughts pertaining to worldly circumstances and pursuits based on identification with a false worldly sense of self. So when your psyche is chock full of all these inclinations and you're faced with all these stressors in the environment, what happens? The inevitable. Your mind starts worrying and running around dealing with all these different, factors in regard to things that need to be acquired to sustain the, as we described before, the complexities of embodiment, or in other words, food, water, shelter, medicine, etc., etc. So this is more or less inevitable in the context of samsāra. So, faced with such adversity, and feeling in response to it an upwelling of humility, for the reasons we discussed earlier, the compiler calls out to Bhagavan with the name Hare, to suggest that Bhagavan is certainly capable of removing all such distress from his bhakta. Because, quote, there are various meanings of the name Hare, two are foremost: he who takes away all inauspiciousness, and he who captivates the mind with prem. The inclusion of the word now underscores the urgency felt by the compiler in this state of humility. So the whole verse is meant here as an expression of humility, so the choice of the name addressing Bhagavan, the inclusion of even these small words like now, add to the spirit, add to the expression of the verse's theme. So now we'll look at this phrase about sudarśana. So as Bhagavan saved Gajendra by beheading the crocodile attacking Gajendra with his sudarshan chakra, so the compiler here prays to Bhagavan to similarly deliver the Gajendra of his mind with his sudarshan chakra. The commentator adds that in the context of the metaphor in the verse, the mention of sudarśana as the means of deliverance can also refer to the, quote, beautiful sight of Bhagavan himself. So, sudarśana. So, darshan can mean sight, or in other words, a person who is a sight, or an object that is seen. So, who is a fine sight, or a beautiful sight. Sudarshan can also be conceived as a name of Bhagavan, or he who is beautiful to see, or he who is a beautiful sight. So, while in the metaphor, the idea is, there was a sudarshan chakra that came down and killed the crocodile attacking Gajendra, then that sudarshan can be conceived of or considered analogous to the experience of Bhagavan giving the sight of himself. So, implying that if Bhakta will give darshan to his ardently prayerful Bhakta, then that Bhakta will be delivered from samsāra. Sri Chakravartipad has also elsewhere made a comparison between the manner in which Bhagavan delivered Gajendra and the manner in which Bhagavan gives darshan of himself in the course of delivering a Bhakta from samsāra. So this is from the Prema section in the Madhurya Kadambini, where he says, O Master, O Bhagavan, O Ocean of Grace, seeing me being chewed by the crocodile bask of the cycle of afflictions engendered by the frightful course of samsāra. So here bask, for anyone who's not familiar, means a pack or a group. So Chakravartipad is using a very similar metaphor that Rupa Gosvami has used in this verse. So he is comparing all the difficulties one faces in samsāra to a pack of crocodiles, or a bask of crocodiles that are chewing me or eating me. So in this state, you, Bhagavan, who are beyond all planes in samsāra, and the butter of whose heart becomes melted by the radiance or the fire of your compassion, have assumed the form of Sri Guru. Cut that bask of crocodiles asunder with the sudarshan chakra of your own darshan, rending of my beginningless ignorance. Freed me from their jaws, cause the syllables of your mantra to enter the path of my ears, out of desire to engage me in service as a maidservant of your 2 lotus feet, freed me from all pain, purified me by means of repeated hearing, chanting, remembering, and so forth of your names and qualities, and enlighten me about your own service by means of the association of your own bhaktas. So, all these features of the path of sadhana bhakti, to take shelter in the feet of the Guru, to receive diksha from the Guru, to receive the mantra, to chant the mantra, to engage in other varieties of bhakti, to have the mind purified thereby, to be freed from varieties of pain, be it the pain of unrelishable association or what have you. All of these things that are experienced by someone on this path about receiving further enlightenment, about what it means to serve Bhagavan, about how to serve Bhagavan by having the company of bhaktas. All of these things can be conceived as Bhagavan himself coming in those forms. Bhagavan himself, as those are all, in that sense, expressions of or gestures of Bhagavan's own compassion for that aspirant. So, seen in that way, this prayer to, quote, free the Gajendra of my mind with the sudarshan, with your sudarshan chakra, can be understood to refer to all of that. In other words, not that he's literally praying for a disc to come out of the sky, but that his mind will be transformed, or his psyche will be purified and imbued with bhava bhakti by this means that's described or summarized here in this passage of the Madhurya Kanambani, with reference to the whole path of sadhana bhakti taught in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. Okay, I'm a little over time. Just one little more compound to be explained. The Sudarshan was spoken of in the verse under discussion. The Sudarshan spoken of in the verse under discussion is further described as, quote, that which cuts away the weariness of the vibhudas. Because the vibhudas, literally the wise, that is the devas and rishis, as per the primary conventional meaning of the word vibhuda, are often troubled and thus grow weary because of disturbances created by asuras. And Bhagavan relieves the devas and rishis of this weariness by subduing asuras with his Sudarshan chakra. So just as he saved Gajendra, as he saves the devas and rishis at various times, like that, please save me. In other words, cut away these miseries, cut away these crocodiles attacking me so that I can engage my mind in bhakti to you. Sri Vidyabhushan Pad, however, offers additional explanations in this regard, saying that the Sudarshan chakra in this case relieved the weariness felt by Gajendra, as well as by the Gandharva Huhu, who had been cursed to become the crocodile attacking Gajendra, and Devala, the rishi who had cursed this Gandharva. So if we look at it in that light, if we add to what he's saying, then in that way that he's relieving the crocodile also by killing the crocodile, it can also be understood that the karma that's coming to us, or the miseries coming to us through our karma, Bhagavan also imbues his grace or uses those as an expression of his own grace as well. That's just if we wanted to elaborate and combine what Baladeva Vidyabhushan is saying with how we understand the Tattinu Kampam verse. Anyway, secondly, Sri Vidyabhushan Pad explains that the word vibhuda can ultimately be interpreted to refer to someone of adverse mentality. If you take V rather than as vishishta but as viruddha, that is one who perceives the presence of essence in essenceless objects of the senses. So in other words, to say that it cuts away the weariness of the vibhudas means these people who think there's some sar in samsāra, who think that there's some real pleasure to be experienced in samsāra, it cuts away all the struggle that they go through, or the weariness they feel because of the struggles that they go through, to pursue this mirage which they'll never actually attain. In this case, the sense becomes that Bhagavan's sudarśana relieves such persons of the weariness created by their lack of attainment of objects of the senses they perpetually desire anew. Meaning, Bhagavan's sudarshan causes the cessation of their thirst for objects of the senses, and as a result of this, their minds can become absorbed in bhakti to Bhagavan. Okay, in summary, the compiler's prayer to Sri Bhagavan, expressive of humility in this verse for the deliverance of the Gajendra of his mind, calls upon Sri Bhagavan to purify the mind of inclinations, vasanas, for worldly objects, that perpetuate subjectivity to the three miseries of samsāra, to circumstances and influences that are unfavorable to bhakti, and thus to distress, so that one can remain ever absorbed in bhakti to Bhagavan, and have the privilege of direct perception of Bhagavan. So, I've gone a little bit over, but this is how we can, through the commentator's points and the extended discussion of fear and the vichitra gati, or the variegated flow of the bhavas of great Mahatmas, how we can understand this expression of humility from Sri Rupa Gosvami Pad. So, I'll conclude here. If anyone has any comment, question, or anything, please feel free to share. Yes?
So, okay, a little bit elongated question, because the example that of prayers and Gajendra, it refers to Gajendra in this Prema Prakara on of Madhura Kadambini. Vishwanath Chakravarti gives this example of a devotee praying for deliverance, or actually deliverance from samsara, pain of samsara. And you can hear read many prayers of this kind of prayers and anywhere else throughout Bhagavatam or other literature, where Vaishnava is basically asking for to liberate from samsara, to obtain bhakti. And to me, I get this impression that this is like a passive attitude of eager deliverance, where there's self-defensiveness is or practical prevention of the sufferings is removed. Basically, Bhakti is totally surrendered at the feet of Bhagavan, completely unable to protect himself, and doesn't do anything to protect himself while praying. And this a little bit conflicts with me, because it seems like that this kind of psychology, it's kind of, although it spiritually is validified, but on the practical ground, the devotee could do something about his own condition to prevent it while praying for deliverance. Let's say somebody is suffering from lack of money, for example. To pray for more money and doing nothing to make more money, to come out of poverty, it's kind of, like illusory, or lazy maybe. I'm not sure if you understand what I'm saying, but the point of the matter is, of course, from one side, devotee, the Sharanagati means complete surrender to Bhagavan, completely denouncing oneself from any type of self-protection. But on actually real life circumstance, why would someone not do anything to protect himself while simultaneously praying to Bhagavan for help? But we don't have this scenarios or examples of being practical, basically, shown on the pages of Bhagavatam and Vaishnava literature. Am I clear?
I'll try. I mean, you said a few
No,
different things.
just
So,
clear what I'm saying because it may be not clear. Just a kind of subtle point. So,
well, I mean, I'll just say a few words and you can let me know if I'm in the ballpark.
mm-hmm.
One thing to consider is, that this situation of every bhakta is unique, and there's also prayers made by bhaktas of different stages and who are in different circumstances. So we may not find that all prayers are of universal application to all bhaktas in all cases. So in our own life, we have to consider what our particular circumstances are, have a sense of our particular stage, and pray and practice, realistically and accordingly, in a way that we aspire to be progressive. So some of the things we hear in Bhagavatam, like we hear about what is it? Ajja-vritti, or the python method where one just lays down and opens the mouth.
Right.
And, if something comes in, then one eats. If nothing comes in, then that's all right. There's these type of extreme measures. And then we hear, in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu about yavarartanuvartina, or to, proceed in accord with what is required, and that to have less or more than what is required to sustain one's engagement is considered unfavorable and irresponsible for a bhakta. So, as per the role in society that one has, it's in that sense a responsibility to sustain things within the proper margin. Having too much is a problem, having too little is a problem. So having what is sufficient is ideal, such that one can engage in bhakti to Bhagavan in an ideal manner. And at the same time, understanding or having the vision that it's Bhagavan himself who is providing everything that we need, who's sustaining everything that we have, who's, our guardian, and so forth. So, according to what capacity we have and the intensity of our absorption in bhakti, in specific bhakti activities, the level to which we may become indifferent to or oblivious about, maintaining other worldly needs, that will largely take care of itself. Or in other words, if someone truly is so absorbed in, their bhakti sadhana that they're just forgetting to do these things, then, there's a high possibility in the view of the faithful that Bhagavan will look after such a person when their absorption is really getting that deep. But if that's not actually the case, and one is, not, at that level of absorption and at that level of detachment and purity, then it may be, it can be somewhat, I don't know what to call it, it can be a little bit pretentious, if you will, to adopt the mode that, I'll just depend upon Bhagavan and, this and that, and then, in the meantime, one is, letting the mind or spending a bunch of time doing things unrelated to Bhagavan, but all the while confident Bhagavan will look after me at every moment, even though I'll spend my time provided for by him doing things unrelated to him, that type of thing, is where it can become a bit slippery. So in that case, to be, grounded, to be, within the kind of norms of the social circumstances that we live in, and with the aim to, create a stable, sustainable living circumstance whereby we can be gradually, progressively more engaged. This is hopeful. This is, a safe way to proceed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as you said, case by case. But so Bhagavatam always gives the ideal examples. Like, for example, in Chaitanya Charitamrita is an example of Mahaprabhu's parshads of complete surrender, like Srinivas, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where Mahaprabhu asked him to, how do you maintain yourself, and what do you do if you're grihasta? And he clapped 3 times. And Mahaprabhu said, what does it mean? Right? And he said, well, if Krishna, Bhagavan doesn't provide first time, and I almost, then I almost am on the crest of survival. The next time, basically, he's saying that if Bhagavan doesn't provide, and I'd clap 3 times, and then I'm ready to disappear, or give chance to Maha to bring Bhagavan to the extreme of my situation, and hoping that you provide for me. Anyway.
Yes, this is the same Srivas Thakur who, made every endeavor to prevent Mahaprabhu's kirtan from being interrupted, even on the night that his own son passed away in his home. So, bhaktas of this depth, of this, direct participants in Bhagavan's Leela, they no doubt show very high ideals, which are inspiring. And at the same time also, it's not that all Mahaprabhu's parshads were like that. Mahaprabhu requested Shivananda Sen to look after Vasudev Datta. The implication being that, according to the circumstances, some bhaktas may have the inclination and the facility of the circumstances to provide for themselves, and others may not. And so what will be suitable for any individual is unique.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it seems like one has to be really sincere and self-analytical, to understand one's own position materially, physically, and spiritually, in order to live his life. Yeah, simple as that.
Yeah. All right, well, we went a little over time today. I hope that's all right. But we completed our discussion of verse 60. So I'll leave it at that. And we'll continue next time with more discussion of these expressions of humility here in Padyavali. Vaishnavebhyo namo namah. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe Shyam.
Jai Radhe.